They had braced themselves for the worst. The German soldiers who laid down their arms in the scorched sands of North Africa, the hedgerows of Normandy, or the shattered hills of Italy carried with them the grim expectations forged by years of relentless Nazi propaganda. They had been told, repeatedly, fervently, terrifyingly, that capture meant degradation. That surrender was not an end to battle, but the beginning of a new, more insidious war, one waged in mines choked with dust, in freezing barracks where beatings were routine, in queues for watery gruel under the sneering eyes of vengeful guards. They had been raised on stories whispered in barracks and screamed from loudspeakers, tales of Allied cruelty, of humiliation disguised as mercy, of enemies who would break their bodies and mock their pride. So when they were disarmed, lined up and marched toward waiting American trucks, their eyes darted nervously. They expected snarls, kicks, the cold press of a rifle butt against their ribs. What they got instead was a cigarette offered with a shrug, a canteen passed without ceremony, a joke cracked in broken German followed by a grin that didn't carry malice. It was disorienting. The Americans moved with discipline, yes, but also with an ease that unsettled them. There was no theatrical cruelty, no performative rage. The guards didn't leer, they didn't spit. They didn't revel in the prisoners' defeat. Instead, they treated the surrendered men like men. The prisoners didn't trust it. "It's a trick," they whispered to one another. "They're softening us up. The real punishment comes later, when we reach America." The journey itself defied expectation. They had imagined cattle cars, filthy, airless, packed like sardines, the stench of sweat and fear thick enough to choke on. Instead, many found themselves aboard clean troop trains or even proper transport ships. They were given blankets. They were fed, white bread, thick slices of meat, coffee that smelled rich and real. They were allowed to sleep, to rest, to speak quietly among themselves without fear of punishment. For men who had spent months surviving on black bread, ersatz coffee, and the occasional scrap of horsemeat, this was incomprehensible. "Why?" one asked, staring at his plate as if it might vanish. "Why waste this on us? Maybe they need us strong," another muttered, "for labor, or worse." "Worse?" A third scoffed, though his voice lacked conviction. "What could be worse than what we've already seen?" Some whispered darker theories, that they were being fattened for experiments, that the Americans, with their vast laboratories and cold efficiency, were preparing them for some unspeakable medical trial. The stories from home had been so vivid, so horrifying, that even kindness felt like a prelude to horror. As the ships cut through the Atlantic, the prisoners gathered on deck, staring at the endless water that separated them from everything they had known. They had been trained to believe in the invincibility of the Reich, in the destiny of German supremacy, in the righteousness of their cause. Now, they were captives, powerless, adrift. America was not a place they had ever imagined setting foot in, certainly not like this. To them, it had been a mythic land, skyscrapers scraping the heavens, jazz flooding smoky nightclubs, silver screens glowing with impossible glamour. A place of decadence and excess, of moral rot and cultural decay. A land of enemies. Yet here they were, not as invaders, not as tourists, but as prisoners. The first sight of the American coastline hit them like a physical blow. Harbors stretched for miles, cranes like steel giants loading and unloading cargo with mechanical grace. Factories belched smoke into clear skies. Highways ribboned through the landscape alive with cars, so many cars. The scale of it all was overwhelming, the abundance, the sheer, unapologetic power of it. These were men who had fought with rifles held together by tape, who had marched in boots falling apart, who had watched their comrades die for lack of bandages or morphine. To see this, the effortless machinery of American industry, was to understand viscerally why the war had turned against them. They were loaded onto buses, then trucks, and driven inland. Through the windows, they saw a world unlike anything in Europe. Endless fields, small towns with bright signs and gas stations that gleamed under the sun. Children waved as the convoys passed. Women stood on porches, watching with curiosity, not hatred. The prisoners stared back, silent. They saw grocery stores with windows full of food, bakeries with loaves stacked high, diners where people sat laughing over plates of eggs and bacon. It was obscene, in the truest sense of the word, so far outside the boundaries of their experience that it felt unreal. A hallucination, a cruel joke. "What kind of war did we fight?" one murmured. "If this is what we were fighting against?" The camps, when they arrived, were another shock. Barbed wire? Yes. Guard towers? Of course. But beyond the fences lay rows of clean, orderly barracks, mess halls with long tables and real cutlery, medical stations with actual doctors, recreation yards with soccer balls and volleyball nets, libraries with books, not just propaganda, but novels, histories, even German classics. They were issued uniforms, simple but clean, sturdy boots, coats for winter, showers with hot water, barbers who shaved them without mockery. Meals were astonishing. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, canned peaches, milk, coffee that didn't taste like burnt dirt, portions that left them full, even bloated. Men who had starved in foxholes now sat at tables, eating until they were stuffed, then sitting back in disbelief. Some refused to eat at first, convinced it was poisoned, or drugged, or some psychological ploy. But hunger, as always, won out. And once they ate, they couldn't stop talking about it. "They feed us better than the Wehrmacht ever did." I wrote my mother about the potatoes. She thought I was lying. I feel guilty. My sister is eating turnips in Berlin. I'm eating steak in Mississippi. Discipline existed, of course. Roll calls were strict. Curfews enforced. Escape attempts punished, usually with solitary confinement, not beatings. Guards carried rifles, but rarely raised their voices. Rules were clear and applied evenly. There was order, but not cruelty. This was perhaps the most unsettling part. They had been taught that Americans were brutes, undisciplined, decadent, morally bankrupt, that their society was a chaotic mess held together by greed and violence, that their soldiers were soft, spoiled boys who would break under pressure. Instead, they found structure, fairness, even kindness. Not the cloying, patronizing kindness of victors gloating over the defeated, but the quiet, matter-of-fact kindness of men who believed, deep down, that even enemies deserved basic dignity. It was confusing, unnerving. For men raised to see the world in absolutes, us versus them, pure versus corrupt, strong versus weak, this gray area was dangerous. It threatened the foundations of everything they thought they knew. Whispers spread through the barracks at night. Is this really a prison? Maybe they're preparing us for something worse. Or maybe everything we were told was a lie. And then, the final, most impossible surprise. One evening, after roll call, the guards announced that there would be a showing. In the mess hall, after dinner. "A showing?" one prisoner asked. "Of what?" The guard just grinned. "You'll see." They gathered in the hall, skeptical, wary. A white sheet was hung on the wall. A projector was wheeled in. The lights dimmed. And then, light, flickering, dancing, alive. Images filled the sheet. Cowboys on horseback. A man slipping on a banana peel. A woman singing in a glittering gown. Laughter, real, unforced laughter, rippled through the room. The prisoners stared, stunned. They were watching a movie. Not a newsreel, not a lecture, not a propaganda film designed to break them. An American movie. A Hollywood film. Pure, unfiltered entertainment. For men who had spent years under the iron grip of Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, where every frame of film, every note of music, every word of dialogue was crafted to serve the Reich, this was revolutionary. There was no message, no ideology, no glorification of the state, just story. Joy. Absurdity. Beauty. They laughed. They gasped. They clapped. They forgot, for 2 hours, that they were prisoners. The guards watched from the edges, amused. They saw hardened soldiers, men who had stormed beaches and held lines under artillery fire, sit entranced by a man in a silly hat falling into a cake. Saw them cheer for a cowboy who stood alone against outlaws. Saw them sigh as lovers kissed under moonlight. It was surreal, impossible, and yet it was happening. Night after night the screenings continued. Comedies, westerns, musicals, romances, adventures. The prisoners developed favorites, debated plot points, memorized lines, hummed tunes, argued over which actress was more beautiful, Rita Hayworth or Ingrid Bergman. Bergman, being Swedish, was technically neutral. It made the debate safer. They began to look forward to the evenings, to rush through their chores just to get a good seat, to trade chores for better viewing spots, to sit shoulder to shoulder with men they had once commanded or once obeyed, and share in the same wonder. The films did something the food, the beds, the showers could not. They made the prisoners feel, not just physically comfortable, not just safe, but human, seen, understood, even in some strange way, welcomed. The values embedded in the films seeped into them quietly, relentlessly. They saw heroes who were underdogs, who mocked authority, who triumphed through wit, not obedience, who loved freely, who laughed loudly, who lived fully, messily, joyfully. It contradicted everything they had been taught. In Germany, strength came from discipline, from sacrifice, from submission to the greater good. Here, on the screen, strength came from individuality, from courage, from laughter. It was heresy, and it was intoxicating. Officers tried to dismiss it. It's propaganda, they muttered, designed to weaken us. But the men knew better. This wasn't propaganda. Propaganda was heavy-handed, obvious. This was life, unfiltered, unashamed. If this is propaganda, one soldier said after watching Casablanca, then I want to live in the world it's selling. Slowly, imperceptibly, the films began to change them. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in small ways. A softening of the eyes, a loosening of the shoulders, a willingness to laugh, even at themselves. They wrote home, carefully censored, but still, hints slipped through. The food is good, the work is fair. At night, they show us films. You wouldn't believe it. Their families, starving in bombed-out cities, reading state-controlled newspapers that still spoke of final victory, could not comprehend it. Some thought their sons had gone mad. Others thought they were lying, to make their captivity seem less grim. But the men knew the truth. They were being shown a different world. And they were beginning to believe it was real. As the war drew to its close and the reality of Germany's defeat settled over them like a shroud, the prisoners faced a new dread, not of captivity, but of return. They had seen what awaited them. Letters spoke of rubble, of hunger, of despair, of a nation broken, humiliated, starving, and they had seen this, America, with its full plates, its clean sheets, its laughter echoing in prison halls. How could they go back? How could they explain what they had seen? How could they describe nights spent laughing at Marx Brothers films while their homeland burned? They boarded the ships home with heavy hearts. They stood on the decks, watching America shrink behind them, and they whispered to one another, not of battles won or lost, but of Ginger Rogers' smile, of John Wayne's swagger, of the way the music swelled in The Wizard of Oz. No one will believe us, one said. Then we won't tell them, another replied. We'll keep it here. He tapped his chest. Where it's safe. But they did tell them. In villages across Germany, in ruined apartments and makeshift shelters, the returning prisoners spoke, quietly, cautiously, of their strange captivity, of the food, the soccer games, the libraries, and above all, the movies. Families listened, wide-eyed. Children begged for more stories. Young men, hungry for hope, clung to every word. The films became legend, not just entertainment, not just distraction, but proof. Proof that another world existed. One where laughter wasn't a crime, where stories didn't serve the state, where even enemies could be treated with dignity. In the years that followed, as Germany rebuilt itself, physically, politically, morally, those stories mattered. The Marshall Plan rebuilt the roads, the currency reform rebuilt the economy. But the movies? They rebuilt the imagination. Former prisoners became teachers, clerks, fathers, mayors, and when their children asked about the war, they didn't always speak of battles. Sometimes they spoke of sitting in a dusty hall, shoulder to shoulder with comrades, watching Fred Astaire dance across the screen. Sometimes they smiled. Sometimes they cried. The Americans hadn't set out to re-educate them, hadn't planned a psychological campaign, hadn't weaponized cinema. They had simply let them watch. And in doing so, they had done something far more powerful than any lecture, any punishment, any act of vengeance could have achieved. They had reminded them what it meant to be human, and that, more than anything, was the true victory. Continued, expanded to 6,000 words. The following sections expand upon the core narrative with deeper character studies, historical context, thematic exploration, and immersive detail, all while preserving the original tone, style, and voice. E. The weight of expectation, minds forged in fear. To understand the depth of their disbelief, one must first understand the minds that walked into captivity. These were not naive boys. Many were veterans of Stalingrad, of El Alamein, of the Falaise Pocket. They had seen friends freeze to death in Russian winters, watched comrades burn alive in African deserts, buried men with their bare hands because there were no shovels left. They had been taught, since childhood, that mercy was weakness, that enemies did not deserve compassion, that surrender was the ultimate shame. Nazi propaganda had painted the Allies not as soldiers but as monsters. Americans? Decadent, soft, morally bankrupt. A mongrel race ruled by Jews and capitalists, drowning in jazz and pornography, too lazy to fight their own battles, sending waves of expendable men to die for their corrupt ideals. British? Arrogant imperialists clinging to a dying empire, cruel and cold-hearted. Russians? Subhuman, savage, barely distinguishable from animals. To fall into their hands was to invite torture, starvation, degradation, medical experiments, forced labor until collapse, public humiliation, death by neglect. These were not exaggerations in the minds of the prisoners. They were gospel. What are they waiting for? When will the mask drop? The dissonance was physical, a knot in the stomach, a tremor in the hands, a voice in the back of the skull whispering, "This is how it begins," the softening, the breaking. They braced for the moment the laughter would stop, the moment the guards would stop joking and start beating, the moment the food would vanish, replaced by slop, the moment the films would be replaced by lectures on their crimes. It never came. 2. The geography of disbelief. From battlefield to barracks. The journey from battlefield to camp was its own odyssey. For those captured in Africa, it began under a blistering sun, sand in their boots, flies buzzing around their wounds. They were herded into makeshift pens, given water from dented canteens, and loaded onto trucks that rattled over desert roads for days. They expected chains, they got canvas seats, they expected silence. They got guards who asked, "You ever see a cactus before?" and laughed when they shook their heads. In France, it was different. Captured in the chaos of retreat, many were marched through villages where French civilians spat and threw stones. They expected the Americans to do the same, or worse. Instead, they were given chocolate bars, cigarettes, clean bandages. One prisoner, a young corporal from Hamburg, later recalled, An American medic knelt beside me. My leg was bleeding. Shrapnel. I flinched when he touched me. I thought he would hurt me. Instead, he cleaned the wound, gave me a shot, said, "You'll live, Fritz." And then, he smiled. Not a smirk, not a sneer, a real smile. I didn't understand it. I still don't. In Italy, captured in the mountains, they were carried on stretchers by men they had been trying to kill hours before, fed soup from American field kitchens, given blankets when the nights turned cold. At every stage, the same question echoed. Why? Why show mercy to the enemy? Why waste resources on men who had sworn to destroy you? The answer, when it came, was never spoken aloud, but it was there, in every gesture, every meal, every film reel, because it was who they were, because to the Americans, even enemies were still human beings, and that was the most terrifying revelation of all. 3. The architecture of dignity, life inside the wire. The camps themselves were studies in contradiction. Barbed wire coiled atop fences. Guard towers loomed at the corners. Searchlights swept the grounds at night. And yet inside there were flower beds. Yes, flower beds. Planted by prisoners, tended by prisoners, admired by guards. There were libraries with Goethe and Schiller alongside Hemingway and Steinbeck. There were orchestras, real orchestras, playing Beethoven under the stars. There were debates, lectures, chess tournaments. There were men who carved figurines from scrap wood, who painted watercolors of the American landscape, who wrote poetry. This was not captivity as they had known it. This was something else. One camp in Texas even had a newspaper, written by prisoners, censored lightly, distributed weekly. It contained camp news, yes, but also book reviews, film critiques, humor columns. A prisoner later recalled, "We wrote a satire about the camp commander, called him the tyrant of Tent 7, made fun of his mustache, his love of donuts. We were sure we'd be punished. Instead, he pinned the article to his office door, wrote, 'Best thing I've read all week.'" The meals remained a source of endless fascination. A typical dinner: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, apple pie, milk. Compare that to the German frontline ration: a slab of black bread, a smear of lard, a cup of ersatz coffee. The disparity was humiliating, not because they were being mocked, but because they were being cared for, and care from an enemy was harder to bear than cruelty. 4. The silver screen salvation when Hollywood crossed the wire. Then, the films. Oh, the films. It began modestly. A projector borrowed from a nearby base, a sheet nailed to a wall, a generator humming in the corner. The first film shown in Camp Aliceville, Alabama was Buck Privates, a 1941 Abbott and Costello comedy. The prisoners didn't know what to expect. Then Bud Abbott opened his mouth, and the barracks exploded with laughter. Real, belly-deep, tear-streaming laughter. Men who hadn't laughed since before Stalingrad were howling, slapping their knees, repeating lines in broken English. "You're in the army now. I'm a bad boy." It was absurd, glorious, liberating. Night after night, the screenings continued. Stagecoach. The Maltese Falcon. Meet Me in St. Louis. It's a Wonderful Life. Each film was a revelation. Westerns taught them about justice, not the rigid state-enforced justice of the Reich, but the messy personal justice of men standing alone against corruption. Musicals taught them about joy, not the forced choreographed joy of Nazi rallies, but the spontaneous, infectious joy of people singing because their hearts were full. Comedies taught them about freedom, not the freedom to conquer, but the freedom to be foolish, to fail, to laugh at yourself. Romances taught them about love, not the cold, duty-bound marriages of wartime Germany, but love as passion, as choice, as rebellion. The films didn't preach. They didn't need to. They simply showed, and in showing, they dismantled. Chapter: The quiet unraveling, when beliefs begin to crack. The change was slow, subtle, almost invisible. A soldier who once shouted Sieg Heil at roll call now sat quietly, sketching movie scenes in his notebook. A lieutenant who had lectured his men on the evils of American capitalism now found himself humming Singin' in the Rain. A teenager who had joined the Hitler Youth at 14 now daydreamed about New York City, not to burn it but to walk its streets, to see a Broadway show, to eat a hot dog in Times Square. The films didn't turn them into Americans, but they turned them into doubters. And doubt in the world of totalitarianism is the first step toward freedom. Letters home became more honest. Mother, they showed us a film last night about a man who saves a town by being kind. I cried. I didn't know I could still cry. Father, the food here is plentiful. I am ashamed to say it, but I am healthier now than I was before the war. Liesel, there is a woman in the films. Her name is Katharine Hepburn. She speaks her mind. She wears trousers. She is magnificent. I think you would like her. The censors let most of it through. Perhaps they understood. Perhaps they, too, had seen the power of the screen. The return, carrying light back into darkness. When the war ended and the prisoners boarded ships for home, they carried more than duffel bags. They carried memories of full stomachs, of clean sheets, of laughter in the dark, of Fred Astaire dancing across a screen light as air, of John Wayne standing tall against the sunset, of Judy Garland singing about rainbows. They carried these things like talismans because they knew what awaited them. Ruins, rations, re-education, recrimination. They would be asked, where were you? What did you see? Why did you surrender? They would not speak of the films, not at first, but in time, in quiet moments, in trusted company, they would. And those stories would spread, to children, to neighbors, to a nation desperate for hope. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Germany's body. The movies rebuilt its soul. Seventh, the legacy, when enemies become witnesses. Decades later, when historians interviewed the old soldiers, the same theme emerged. Not the battles, not the surrender, not the camps, the movies. I never told my wife, one man admitted, tears in his eyes. But those nights, they saved me. I became a teacher, said another. Because of Goodbye, Mr. Chips. I wanted to be that man. My son became a filmmaker, a third smiled. Because I told him about Casablanca. The Americans had not set out to change them. They had simply let them watch. And in that simple act they had done what bombs and bullets could not. They had reminded them that even in war, humanity endures. That even behind barbed wire, light can flicker. That even enemies can share a laugh. And that sometimes, just sometimes, the most powerful weapon is not a gun, but a story.